There are games you finish and games you inhabit. Elden Ring is the second kind. Released in February 2022 by the Japanese studio From Software, Elden Ring arrived with considerable anticipation, a collaboration between one of gaming's most respected directors and one of the world's most celebrated authors, set in an open world that promised to be unlike anything the studio had attempted before. Tonight, we're diving deep into 3 hours of Elden Ring lore to help you unwind and fall asleep. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments below, and also leave a like if you enjoy these kinds of videos. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into it. The weather system in Elden Ring is tied to specific locations' emotional states. The weather across the lands between is not randomized or cosmetic. Each region has a fixed meteorological personality that reflects its history and spiritual condition. The area surrounding the academy is permanently overcast because the magical experiments conducted there disrupted the local atmosphere centuries ago. The region ruled by the Storm Lord is perpetually stormy, not because of natural weather patterns, but because the Lord's power literally manifests as atmospheric violence. The golden fields near the Erdtree are always bathed in warm light because the tree's grace physically affects the air around it. Learning to read weather as emotional and historical data rather than visual texture gives every region a personality before you've spoken to a single person in it. The Elden Ring itself is never fully explained. So, despite being the title of the game and the central object of the entire story, the Elden Ring, the golden construct that governs the laws of the world, is never fully defined. You never learn exactly what it is made of, who originally created it before the God Queen received it, or what it was like before it was shattered. Characters describe its effects and its history, but never its nature. Several lore scholars argue this is deliberate. The Elden Ring is meant to function as a stand-in for any system of order imposed on a world that existed before and after that system, and defining it too precisely would undermine its metaphorical function. It is the game's central mystery and its central metaphor simultaneously, and answering one would destroy the other. The giant skeletons found across the map were once a civilization. Scattered across the lands between, half buried in hillsides, slumped against ruins, and partially submerged in lakes, are the remains of beings far larger than any living creature in the game. These are not decorative props. Item descriptions confirm they are the remains of a giant civilization that predated the current order by thousands of years, who were hunted to near extinction during a war that the ruling order prefers not to discuss. The few giants who survived were imprisoned and used as living furnaces, their bodies so enormous and so warm that the ruling civilization burned them slowly for heat and light over generations. The bones you walk past are the uncollected dead of a genocide the game's history books call a necessary war. Did you know that the game's sound design uses reversed audio for undead enemies? The sound effects for many of the game's undead enemies, the skeletons, the reanimated soldiers, the ancient warriors, they were all created by recording normal human movement sounds and playing them in reverse, then layering them with conventional effects. This gives undead enemies a subtle wrongness that most players feel rather than consciously identify. Footsteps that seem to arrive before they land. Breathing that sounds like it goes in when it should go out. The technique was used specifically to create subconscious unease rather than obvious horror, and it succeeds precisely because most players never realize why fighting undead enemies feels slightly more unsettling than fighting living ones. There is a hidden quest line that can only be started at night. One of the game's more obscure quest lines involving a character studying the nature of the outer gods that exist beyond the known universe, can only be initiated by speaking to the relevant NPC at a specific checkpoint during the night cycle. During the day, the NPC is present, but gives only generic dialogue. At night, though, they become willing to discuss their real research. The reason, given in their own dialogue if you press them, is that the outer gods they study are more perceptible at night when the Erdtree's light doesn't interfere with observation. It is one of the few cases where the day and night cycle gates not an enemy spawn, but a conversation, and missing it means missing an entire thread of cosmological lore. The crumbling city was designed as a vertical level. Most of Elden Ring's areas are navigated horizontally, with vertical movement being a secondary consideration. The crumbling city area, though, reached later in the game, inverts this completely. It is designed as a vertical space where falling is the primary mode of movement, and the danger is not enemies, but the ground far below. The development team has described it as a deliberate palate cleanser after hours of conventional navigation, and as a way of making the player feel the city's instability physically. Every platform you land on feels precarious because the design constantly reminds you how far down the bottom is. It is the only area in the game where the level design itself is the primary antagonist. Did you know that armor sets often contain contradictory lore across their pieces? The different armor sets in the game, divided into helmet, chest, arms, and legs, often tell slightly different stories in their individual descriptions, reflecting the fact that armor pieces were frequently separated, traded, inherited, or repaired over centuries. A helmet might describe its original owner as a heroic figure, while the chest piece, perhaps acquired by a different person, describes the same figure as a deserter. The gauntlets might have been added by a third owner entirely and describe none of the original history. Reading a full armor set's descriptions as a unified document gives you one story. Reading each piece individually, though, gives you 3 or 4 contradictory perspectives on the same person, like reading rival historians. Elden Ring punishes staying in one area too long. In certain regions of the game, enemies become progressively more aggressive the longer you spend in their territory without leaving. This is not explicitly communicated anywhere in the game. Players discovered it by noticing that enemies who were passive on arrival became hostile after extended exploration, and that the hostility reset after leaving the region and then returning. The lore justification, found in item descriptions nearby, is that the creatures in these regions have a territorial awareness that activates in response to a sustained presence they cannot drive out. It mirrors real animal behavior with remarkable accuracy, and is the kind of emergent natural system detail that players only notice when they're doing something unusual. The game's opening cinematic contains the ending. Did you know that the opening cinematic that plays when you start the game, which most players watch once and then skip on subsequent playthroughs, contains visual references to every ending in the game, encoded in imagery that is meaningless without context? Specific color combinations, the arrangement of figures, and the direction of light in certain shots all correspond to specific endings' visual language. On a first viewing, it reads as epic fantasy imagery. On a viewing after completing all 6 endings, it reads as a compressed summary of every possible conclusion. The development team confirmed this was actually intentional. The opening was designed as a document that rewards having finished the game, which means it is technically the last thing you fully understand, not the first. The Wandering Nobles are the game's saddest enemies. The Wandering Noble enemies, poorly armed, stumbling figures in tattered finery found in the early areas, are described in their item lore as members of the ruling class who lost their minds when the Golden Order collapsed. They are not soldiers or monsters. They are aristocrats who had their entire identity, their purpose, and worldview stripped away simultaneously and simply kept walking because they had nothing else to do. Their attack animations are not combat moves but confused flailing. Their weapons are candles, fans, and walking sticks, decorative objects they happen to be holding when everything fell apart. They are the game's first enemies, and its most quietly tragic ones, and they are usually killed within a second, without any thought by players who haven't yet learned to read what they're looking at. The map's blank spaces were intentionally left mysterious. The edges of the in-game map, which fade into blank parchment rather than hard borders, were a deliberate design choice made after an internal debate about whether to use a hard map edge or imply continuation. The team chose implication. The blank spaces are not empty in lore. Several item descriptions reference lands beyond the map's edges as real places with real histories. The merchant civilization referenced in earlier facts was said to have traveled from beyond the eastern edge. The outer gods studied in certain questlines are implied to approach from directions the map doesn't cover. The world of Elden Ring is explicitly larger than the game's playable space, and the blank parchment is the team's way of acknowledging that without defining it. The Tarnished's resurrection was not unique. Your character's return from death to pursue the Elden Ring is presented early in the game as a special, significant event, grace calling you back for a purpose. What later item descriptions and NPC dialogue reveal, though, is that your resurrection was not unique. Many Tarnished were called back at the same time, all drawn towards the same goal. Most of them didn't make it to the end. You can find their remains across the world. The cave from the beginning, but also corpses in different locations wearing armor that suggests they got further than most before failing. Your character is not the chosen one. You are the latest in a long line of attempts, and the only thing that makes you different from all the others is that you haven't died permanently yet. Did you know that the Frenzied Flame cannot be refused once accepted? If you accept the Frenzied Flame, the destructive force that enables the game's most extreme ending, it physically brands your character's body and cannot be removed through normal means. Your character's appearance changes, certain NPCs react with horror, and the ending is effectively locked in unless you complete an extremely specific and unintuitive sequence of steps involving a questline that most players won't have done. The game tells you none of this before you accept it. The acceptance happens in a moment of apparent curiosity. You open a door, you receive something, and then you discover the full weight of what you agreed to. It is one of the most effective examples of a game using mechanics to simulate the feeling of a decision that seemed small and turned out to be enormous. Certain bosses have dialogue you will almost certainly never hear. Several major bosses have extended dialogue lines, full speeches, laments, or explanations of their motivations, that play only if you stand still in front of them long enough without engaging. Most players, though, conditioned by the game's difficulty, attack immediately. The dialogue continues even as combat begins, meaning you can hear fragments of it mid-fight, but the complete speeches require you to deliberately hold back. At least one boss's complete pre-fight monologue reframes their entire role in the story in a way that makes the subsequent fight significantly more emotionally complex. The game never tells you to wait. It simply made the dialogue available for the player who chose patience over reflex. The Sacred Tears upgrade a specific item for a lore-based reason. The tears found in churches, which upgrade your healing flask, are described in item lore as literal tears wept by the God Queen at moments of grief or regret. Each church was built at a location where she stopped and cried, and the tear crystallized into a permanent object at that spot. The upgrade to your healing flask is not a mechanical enchantment. You are adding the compressed grief of a god to your medicine. The healing becomes more potent with each addition, not because of chemistry, but because divine sorrow is, in the game's cosmology, a substance of enormous power. The practical effect and the lore explanation are the same thing described in two different languages. The Dragon War is the most important event nobody talks about. The ancient war between the ruling order and the dragon civilization, which ended with dragons being largely driven out or subjugated, is the single most historically consequential event in the game's backstory. It determined the shape of the entire world, which species held power, which was suppressed, and which compromised. And yet, almost no character in the present-day story discusses it directly. You reconstruct it entirely from item descriptions, ancient architecture, and the behavior of the few surviving dragons. The silence around it is itself meaningful. The victors wrote a history in which the war barely appears, which is the most realistic detail in a game full of realistic details about how power works. Did you know that the game has a functional economy that collapsed off-screen? The currency system, golden runes used to purchase items and level up, was once a functioning economy. Item descriptions describe markets, trade routes, and pricing conventions that existed before the shattering. The reason runes are now found in the bodies of enemies and scattered across ruins is that the economic collapse was total and instantaneous. When the Elden Ring shattered, the social structures that gave currency meaning dissolved overnight, and gold became just a material rather than a medium of exchange. You are essentially picking up the cash from a bank that burned down a century ago and spending it at the few remaining vendors who still honor it out of habit or necessity. The giant jar characters have an unexpectedly deep backstory. The jar-wearing characters, beloved by the community for their simple, earnest personalities, are described in item lore as having a very specific and strange origin. Warrior jars are created by the placing of remains of many fighters inside a clay pot and then sealing it, with the intention that the collective martial spirit of the fallen warriors animates the jar as a new being. This means that each jar character is not one person, but many, fused into a single identity that retains fragments of all of them. The cheerful simplicity of characters like this is, in lore, the result of many complex personalities averaging out into something uncomplicated through the merging process. Their goodness is the distillation of many people's best qualities. The Carian royal family had a different cosmological allegiance. The magic-using royal family, whose legacy is felt across several regions of the game, and also whose members appear as both allies and bosses, did not worship the Erdtree. Their allegiance was to the moon and the stars, which is the game's cosmology representing a completely different metaphysical system, older, colder, and associated with fate rather than order. This is why their magic looks different from Golden Order magic, why their architecture incorporates astronomical imagery, and why one of their members is central to the game's most cosmologically radical ending. They were never fully part of the Golden Order's world. They tolerated each other out of mutual political convenience, and the tension between their worldview and the dominant one runs through every item associated with their family. The game simulates ecosystem collapse in certain regions. In the areas most severely affected by the Scarlet Rot, the Lake region particularly, the environmental storytelling depicts a complete ecosystem collapse in geological sequence. The outermost edges of the rot spread show recently infected creatures alongside healthy ones. Moving inward, you find only infected creatures, and then further in, no living things remain at all, only the rot itself and the structures it has created. The sequence mirrors real-world ecological collapse patterns with enough accuracy that several ecologists have noted it online. It was clearly researched rather than imagined, and it makes the rot's horror concrete in a way that no amount of dramatic dialogue could ever achieve. every remembrance boss drops an item that summarizes their tragedy. The major bosses, the ones whose memories you can consume for power, each drop an item upon death whose description is a compressed summary of their entire life story, written in past tense as if by a historian looking back. These descriptions are some of the best writing in the game, and they are also some of the most easily missed. Players often consume or trade the remembrance without reading the associated item's description. Each one recontextualizes the boss you just fought. A figure who seemed like an obstacle is revealed to have been someone specific, with specific losses and specific choices, and the description mourns them in the same breath it catalogs their power. The game's menus are designed to reflect the world's aesthetic. The user interface, the menus, the item screens, the status displays, were designed by the same art team responsible for the in-world architecture and illuminated manuscripts visible in the game. The font choices, the border designs, and the color palette of the menus all use motifs drawn from the game's internal visual culture. The same interlocking patterns found on Erdtree architecture appear as menu borders, and the golden color of important interface elements matches the specific shade of the Erdtree's light, rather than a generic yellow. The interface is not a neutral container for the game's content. It is itself a designed object that exists within the game's aesthetic world. Ricard's boss fight is a deliberate genre parody. The boss fight against the Lord who merged himself with a giant snake god, one of the most visually spectacular fights in the entire game, is a deliberate and affectionate parody of a specific type of action game boss fight. The fight requires a special weapon found in the arena, deals with an enormous body that fills most of the screen, and involves specific attack phases borrowed from a different genre of game entirely. The large-scale spectacle bosses common in Japanese action games of the previous decade. The development team has acknowledged this was intentional, a moment of genre self-awareness within an otherwise consistent tone. It is the game winking at its own medium without breaking the seriousness of its world. Did you know that the lore contradicts itself deliberately? Several pieces of item lore in the game directly contradict each other on matters of historical fact, not through error, but through design. Different factions within the game's world had different historical records, different political motivations for recording events in particular ways, and different access to the actual truth of what happened. The contradictions are mapped to their sources. Items associated with the ruling order describe certain events one way. Items associated with rebels or outsiders describe the same events differently. Miyazaki has confirmed this was intentional, modeling the way real history works, not as a single agreed truth, but as a contested collection of perspectives, each shaped by who was writing and what they needed the past to mean. The boss fog walls actually have a lore explanation. The translucent fog barriers that appear before boss encounters are from software tradition across all of their games, are given an in-world explanation in Elden Ring for the first time. Item descriptions associated with certain dungeon structures describe sealing mechanisms built into sacred or dangerous spaces to prevent the power within from spilling out into the surrounding area. The fog is not a game mechanic awkwardly inserted into a realistic world. It is, in lore, a containment system built by whoever constructed the space, meant to keep whatever was imprisoned or dwelling inside from affecting the outside world. This reframes every fog wall as evidence of something so dangerous that someone felt they had to build a door around it. The Nomadic Warriors Cookbook series is a complete cultural document. The series of crafting cookbooks attributed to nomadic warriors found across the game in various locations form, when read as a complete collection, a comprehensive document of a traveling culture's practical knowledge. The early volumes cover basic survival, the middle volumes introduce combat applications, and the later volumes contain increasingly specialized techniques that suggest a culture that had refined its methods over generations. The final volume, the hardest to find, contains techniques that are only useful in very specific circumstances, suggesting a culture experienced enough to have developed solutions to problems most people never encounter. It is an anthropological document disguised as a crafting guide. Did you know that the Stormhawk enemies were actually once companion animals? So, the large, aggressive birds of prey found guarding certain towers and parapets, which attack on sight and are notably more dangerous than their appearance suggests, are described in item lore as having originally been bred as companion animals and hunting birds for the nobility. The specific tower enemies are implied to have been left behind when their owners died or fled, and to have gradually become feral over the decades since. Their aggression is not natural to their species, but is the behavior of domesticated animals that lost their owners and had to adapt to survival without human care. The fact that they can be found wearing decorative leg rings, the kind used on trained hunting birds, is visible in their character models and is a detail almost nobody notices. The game contains music that cannot be heard without specific actions. Several pieces of music in Elden Ring's soundtrack are only accessible if you perform specific, unintuitive actions at specific locations. Entering a room from a particular direction, standing in a precise position, or completing a sequence of actions that triggers a unique ambient state. These pieces are not boss themes or area themes, but something between, mood pieces that play in transitional moments that most players pass through too quickly to even notice. The composer has described them as rewards for players who move slowly and pay attention, and as a way of ensuring that the game's musical experience is never fully complete on a single playthrough. The Outer Gods are the game's true villains, and nobody fights them. The ultimate antagonists of the game's cosmology, the Outer Gods, the vast entities from beyond the known universe who manipulate the world's events from an unreachable distance, are never confronted, they're never seen, and they're never defeated. Every villain in the game is, to varying degrees, a puppet or a victim of these entities. The rot that destroyed a goddess came from an outer god. The frenzy flame is an outer god. The various corrupting influences throughout the game trace back to external entities that the world has no mechanism to resist. The game's endings address symptoms rather than causes. Whatever you choose to do at the end of the game, the outer gods remain, which is either the setup for a sequel or the game's most honest statement about the nature of power. Some forces are simply beyond the reach of any single person's heroism. Specific illusory walls require more than one hit to reveal. The game contains hidden passages concealed behind walls that appear solid but disappear when struck, a From Software tradition. In previous games, a single hit always revealed them. In Elden Ring though, certain illusory walls require multiple hits before they vanish, with no indication that one hit was insufficient. This was discovered by players who hit a wall once, concluded it was real, and moved on, only to find, on a second playthrough, that hitting it repeatedly revealed a passage. The community reaction was extreme enough that many players began hitting every wall multiple times as a matter of course, which was not the intended takeaway, but does reflect the game's success at creating a world where the rules themselves feel uncertain. The Elden Beast is not the final boss anyone expected. The absolute final boss of the base game, the Elden Beast, is not a character in the conventional sense. It has no dialogue, no questline, no NPC who mentions it by name before you encounter it, and no item description that refers to it directly. It appears as if from nowhere in the game's final moments, and is described as only in the item it leaves behind. A cosmic entity that is itself the physical embodiment of the Elden Ring, essentially the lore of the world made flesh. It has no motivation, no personality, and no history outside of its function. Fighting it is not a confrontation with a villain, but with an abstraction. The game's final boss is the concept of imposed order defending itself, which is either profound or deeply strange, depending on your tolerance for philosophical game design. The game rewards players who read before they act. Throughout the game, items can be used, consumed, or traded before their description has been read, and several significant mistakes are made by players who do exactly that. Certain items, when consumed, produce permanent changes to the game state that cannot be reversed. Others, when given to NPCs without reading the context, advance quest lines in ways that close off other options. The game never forces you to read anything. It simply makes reading the correct choice by attaching consequences to acting without understanding. It is one of the few games that treats literacy, in the sense of actually reading the text in front of you, as a gameplay skill with mechanical rewards. Several areas have unique idle animations for enemies that actually tell stories. When enemies are unaware of your presence and in their default state, many of them perform idle animations that reveal their inner life. Certain soldiers sit and stare at nothing. Others repeatedly attempt and fail to complete a task, lifting something they're no longer strong enough to move, or performing a ritual gesture they've lost the meaning of. A specific enemy type near the game's end can be found kneeling in a posture of prayer if you observe them before triggering their awareness. These animations are never seen during combat and require deliberate stealth or observation to witness. They were made by animators who knew most players would never see them, and they made them anyway. The game's final area was designed to feel wrong. The location of the final sequence of the game, where the last bosses are fought and the endings are triggered, was deliberately designed to feel geometrically and atmospherically incorrect. The space is too large in ways that are hard to define. The light comes from the wrong direction. The architecture doesn't follow the rules established by every other location in the game. This wrongness was intentional. The development team wanted the final area to feel like a space that is at the boundary of the world's reality, where the rules that govern everywhere else have begun to break down. Players frequently describe the area as dreamlike or uncanny without being able to say exactly why, which is the precise effect the team was aiming for. Smith script weapons reference an entirely lost civilization. A specific category of weapons introduced in the expansion, designed to be thrown and to return to the user, are described as originating from a civilization so old that no other record of it exists anywhere in the game. The civilization that created them is not mentioned in any other item description, any NPC dialogue, or any environmental detail. The weapons are the only evidence that this civilization existed at all, and the descriptions are careful to note that even the scholars who studied them couldn't determine when they were made or what happened to the people who made them. It is the game acknowledging, through a weapon description, that some history is truly lost, not hidden or obscured, just simply gone. The tree spirits are the Erdtree's immune system. The large, writhing enemies found inside certain sacred spaces, the ones that move like they exist in a different physical medium than everything else, are described in item lore as entities generated by the Erdtree itself in response to the presence of intruders or corruption. They are not creatures that moved in from outside. They are produced by the tree the way a body produces white blood cells. Their presence in a location indicates that the Erdtree perceived something wrong there and generated a response. The locations where you find them, read in this light, are places the Erdtree were actively trying to heal or protect, and you, classified by the tree's immune system as a foreign body, are simply the latest thing it's trying to eliminate. The Shattering War left geological evidence. The war between the demigods that preceded the game's events, in which enormous beings with divine power fought each other across the continent, left permanent marks on the geography. Certain craters visible in the landscape are impact sites from divine weapons. Certain mountain formations were created by the displacement of matter during battles. Several lakes that appear natural are described in item lore as having been formed when a divine being fell and their body heat melted the surrounding terrain. The war ended before the game begins, but you walk across its aftermath for the entire game, and the land itself is a casualty that never recovered. The game's difficulty is calibrated to create specific emotional moments. From Software's internal playtesting process for Elden Ring, as described by development team members, focused not on achieving a specific win rate or death count, but on identifying moments in each fight where the player was likely to feel specific emotions, such as panic, triumph, desperation, and also relief. Each boss was iterated until the emotional sequence felt right, regardless of objective difficulty metrics. This is why fights that are statistically easier than others can feel harder. The emotional sequence was designed to feel more threatening, and why certain mechanically demanding bosses feel fair despite being objectively punishing. The difficulty is a delivery mechanism for a specific emotional experience, not a barrier for its own sake. The grace trails show you what the world wants, not what you should do. The golden trails of grace that guide you towards your next objective, pointing towards the Erdtree and significant locations, are not a navigation system added for player convenience. They are, in lore, a manifestation of the Erdtree's will, physically guiding chosen beings towards its purposes. This means the grace trails are not neutral. They represent a specific agenda, the restoration of the Elden Ring on the Erdtree's terms. Players who follow them are, without necessarily realizing it, doing exactly what the Erdtree wants. The quest lines that lead to alternative endings, Rani's most notably, require you to stop following the grace trails and strike out in directions the grace does not point. The navigation system is, in lore terms, just propaganda. The game never tells you that you've won. When you complete any of the 6 endings and the final screen appears, the game does not confirm that you succeeded, that the world is better, or that your efforts meant anything beyond the specific transformation that occurred. There is no victory screen, there's no score, there's no congratulations. The credits roll and the game returns to the title screen, where you can start again. This is the game's final and most complete statement of its philosophy. Meaning is not conferred by external validation, but constructed by the player from the experience they had. Whether what you did was good, whether the world is better, whether any of it was worth it. These are questions the game has been asking for 80 or 100 hours, and it refuses to answer them at the end because it never thought it was its place to do so. That has always been yours. The Tarnished's exile was an act of cosmic bureaucracy. The backstory of your character, cast out of the lands between for losing the grace of the Erdtree, is presented early in the game as a kind of divine punishment, implying moral failure or unworthiness. Later item descriptions reframe it entirely. The Tarnished were not exiled because they did something wrong. They were exiled because the Erdtree's grace simply withdrew from them. An automatic, impersonal process, like a body rejecting a transplant. No judgment was made. No crime was committed. The ruling order then treated the absence of grace as evidence of unworthiness, because admitting that grace could withdraw arbitrarily would undermine the entire theological basis of their civilization. The Tarnished were made into sinners to protect a system that could not afford to admit its grace was fallible. The expansion Shadow Realm is the base game's world inverted. The Shadow Realm visited in the expansion, a separate plane accessible through a specific ritual, is not simply a darker version of the lands between. It is, in several meaningful ways, its structural opposite, where the base game's world is dying and decaying from a position of former glory. The Shadow Realm was never allowed to reach glory in the first place. It was suppressed and hidden at the moment of its potential greatness. Where the base game's tragedy is loss, the expansion's tragedy is prevention. where the base game asks what happened when a civilization falls. The expansion asks what happens to a civilization that was never permitted to rise. The two worlds are designed to be read against each other, each making the other's themes clearer by contrast. Did you know that the crows are implied to be a spy for a higher power? The large, aggressive crows found in the early areas of the game, which are notably more dangerous than their appearance suggests, and famously one of the first things to kill new players, are described in item lore as having an unusual relationship with the concept of grace. Several descriptions associated with them hint that they are drawn to Tarnished specifically, and that their aggression towards chosen beings is not random animal behavior. A specific NPC, if asked about them, gives a response that is deliberately evasive in a way that implies knowledge they are unwilling to share. The community interpretation, supported by enough textual evidence to be taken seriously, is that the crows function as a surveillance mechanism for some entity that monitors the movements of returning Tarnished without making its observation known. Every cookfire in the world has a story in its placement. The small, burnt-out campfires scattered across the lands between, which serve no mechanical purpose and cannot be interacted with, are placed with the same deliberateness as every other environmental detail. They are always found in locations where someone would logically have stopped to rest, sheltered from wind, near water sources, at natural waypoints along routes between significant locations. Some have the remnants of bedrolls or discarded equipment nearby. They are the traces of travelers who passed through before you, not named characters, not quest givers, just people who were cold and stopped for a while and then continued or didn't. They make the world feel inhabited in a way that no amount of architectural detail achieves, because architecture implies civilization, while a cold campfire implies a single, specific person who was here and is now gone. The round table holds fireplace is the most important prop in the game. The large fireplace at the center of the round table hold, around which characters gather and which provides the warm light of the hub area, is described in a single, easy-to-miss item interaction as containing a fire that has been burning continuously since the hold was first established, fed not by wood or fuel, but by the collective purpose of the Tarnished who gathered there. When characters begin to die or leave over the course of the game's events and the hold becomes emptier, the fire visibly dims. By the end of the game, depending on your choices, it may be nearly out. It is a fire that measures community, and watching it fade as your companions disappear is one of the game's most quietly devastating visual storytelling choices, made entirely through an object most players glance at once and never examine again. Did you know that the game's bosses were designed in a specific emotional order? The sequence in which major bosses appear was not determined by geography or story logic alone, but by emotional pacing, a deliberate arc of feeling that the development team mapped out before placing individual bosses in specific locations. The early bosses are designed to feel overwhelming and then conquerable. The middle bosses introduce tragedy into the combat. You begin to understand who you're fighting before you fight them. The late bosses are designed to feel inevitable rather than triumphant. The final boss is designed to feel neither like victory nor defeat, but like something harder to name. The emotional sequence was treated as a composition, like movements in a piece of music, with each boss representing not just a challenge, but a specific note in a larger feeling the game was building towards. The Stone's Word keys are a form of ancient legal document. The sword-shaped stone keys, used to unseal imp statues blocking certain passages, are described in item lore not as magical tools but as legal instruments, the equivalent of warrants or permits issued by the ruling order that granted the holder the right to access restricted spaces. The fact that they still work centuries after the order that issued them has collapsed is treated in the lore as a quirk of how the sealing magic was designed. It recognizes the key's form rather than its issuing authority, meaning a key made yesterday and a key made 1,000 years ago are functionally identical. You are using the bureaucratic paperwork of a dead civilization to open doors in a world that has forgotten what the paperwork was for. Malenia is the most mysterious main character in the game. Despite being the character you interact with most frequently in the early and middle portions of the game, she gives you your horse, levels you up, and guides your early journey, Malenia is the character about whom the least is definitively known. Her origin, her true nature, her relationship to the God Queen whose name she shares a linguistic root with, and her ultimate fate in most endings are all left unresolved. She describes herself as having no flesh, no grace, and no origin she can clearly remember. Item descriptions associated with her contain more questions than answers. The community has produced more competing theories about Malenia than about any other character in the game, and none of them have been confirmed or denied. She is the person you spend the most time with and understand the least, which is either a flaw or the most human thing about her. The game simulates the experience of discovering ancient history. The specific method by which Elden Ring delivers its lore, scattered, fragmentary, contradictory, requiring assembly from disparate sources, is not simply a stylistic choice. It is a simulation of how historians actually encounter ancient history, through objects rather than documents, through physical evidence rather than testimony, through the things that survived rather than the things that were meant to survive. What you learn about the lands between is shaped by what happened to be preserved, who happened to be around to remember it, and what political circumstances determined which records were kept. This means your understanding of the world is structurally similar to a historian's understanding of a real lost civilization, partial, contested, and always subject to revision when new evidence appears. Did you know that the game's last secret has arguably not been found yet? The Elden Ring community, one of the most dedicated and technically sophisticated player communities in gaming history, with members who have analyzed every byte of the game's code and every pixel of its environments, operates on the widely shared belief that the game still contains undiscovered content, not glitches or cut material, but deliberately placed secrets that have not yet been found, because no one has yet done the correct thing in the correct place at the correct time. This belief is supported by the game's track record. Secrets considered impossible to find have been found years after release, always through the combination of code analysis and in-world experimentation that the community excels at. Whether or not a true final secret exists, the belief that it might is itself meaningful. It is a testament to a game that trained its players to trust that there is always something more, and to keep looking even when there seems to be nothing left to find. Did you know that George R.R. Martin wrote the mythology, not the actual story? So many players assume that George R.R. Martin wrote Elden Ring's plot, but his contribution was far more foundational. Martin crafted the mythos, the prehistory of the lands between, the stories of the Emperines, the nature of the Elden Ring, and the events leading up to the Shattering. Miyazaki and his team then built the game's present-day narrative on top of that foundation. This division of labor is why the world feels so historically layered. Martin provided the ancient history that characters reference in hushed tones, while Miyazaki gave us the ruins left behind. Marika and Radagon are actually the same person. So one of the game's most shocking revelations, delivered almost as an afterthought via an item description, is that Queen Marika and Radagon of the Golden Order are literally the same being. So Radagon was not merely Marika's husband, he was her male alter ego, a second soul occupying the same body. This is why Marika's children by Radagon are technically her own half-siblings. The duality is reflected in their stat inversions. Marika governs faith, Radagon governs strength. Whether this split was voluntary, a consequence of godhood, or something imposed upon them by the greater will remains deliberately ambiguous. The Erdtree is built on the body of an outer god. So the Erdtree, the golden beacon at the center of the lands between, is not merely a divine tree, it's actually a parasite. So deep beneath Lanedale lies the Elden Beast, the physical embodiment of the greater will, which descended from the stars and took root in the world. The Erdtree grew from or around this being, and the entire Golden Order, so the religion, the grace, the cycle of death and rebirth, is essentially a system created by an alien god to maintain control over the lands between. Burning the Erdtree, then, is not just sacrilege, it is arguably liberation. Godwyn was the first to die, and yet cannot actually die. So Godwyn the Golden was the first of the demigods to fall, slain on the night of the Black Knives by assassins using blades imbued with a fragment of the Rune of Death, stolen from the Elden Ring itself. But only his soul was killed, leaving his flesh alive and deathless. This resulted in a horrifying condition. His body continued to grow beneath the lands between, spreading roots of flesh through the earth, giving rise to the Death Roots and the entire Prince of Death phenomena. Godwyn's corpse is effectively becoming the land itself, a living death that cannot actually end. Did you know that the Dung Eater's curse targets the entire cycle of rebirth? So the Dung Eater is among the game's most repugnant characters by design, but his power is among the most cosmologically significant. His curse, the Fell Curse, defiles the souls of those it marks, preventing them from returning to the Erdtree's cycle of rebirth after death. In a world where death is managed by the Golden Order as a system of recycled souls feeding the Erdtree, the Fell Curse is a wrench thrown directly into the machinery. The Blessing of Despair ending, achieved by giving the Dung Eater enough seedbed curses, unleashes this defilement upon the entire world, condemning all future generations to a form of true, irrecoverable death. He is, in his own horrifying way, offering liberation from the cycle. Did you know that the entire Volcano Manor quest is a theological argument? So the Volcano Manor, home of Rickard's court and the group of assassins who kill fellow Tarnished, presents itself as mere villainy, but its underlying motivation is revolt against destiny. Rickard and his followers reject the idea that the Tarnished must serve the Greater Will's plan. Their killings target Tarnished who are on the path, who are fulfilling their divine purpose. This is not random cruelty, it is a theological sabotage. The Manor's questline forces the player to become an assassin themselves, and the ultimate reward is access to Rickard, a god who rejected godhood. Whether the Manor is monstrous or righteous depends entirely on what the player believes about the Greater Will's right to dictate fate. Millicent is one of Melania's clones and embodies what Melania cannot. So Millicent is one of numerous girls grown from Melania's scarlet rot bloom, fragments of the goddess given their own existence. She is biologically a piece of Melania, but while Melania is trapped in an endless cycle of battle and duty, Millicent's arc is about discovering what individuality means when your own very origin erases it. Her questline ends either with her achieving genuine selfhood or being killed by her jealous sisters. The tragedy is that Melania, who is ancient and powerful, has never managed what Millicent, her fragmented copy, achieves in a few weeks of wandering, the simple act of choosing who to be. The lands between may exist inside the Elden Ring itself. So, a subtle but mind-bending implication woven through item descriptions and the game's final boss encounter is that the lands between is not a conventional world. It may exist within or around the Elden Ring, the cosmic force the game is named for. The Elden Ring is described as governing the fundamental laws of the world, and the Elden Beast that the player fights at the climax arrived from the depths of the Erdtree, from beyond the stars. The cosmology of the game positions the lands between as a kind of divine theater, a world maintained by competing outer gods, each trying to impose their version of reality. The Elden Ring is less an object and more of a rulebook, and the game is about who gets to write the next edition. Did you know that Blade's loyalty is literally hardwired into his existence? So Blade the Half-Wolf is a shadow created by the Two Fingers to serve and watch over Ranni. This is standard practice. Empyreans are given shadows to act as both protectors and observers, ensuring the Fingers maintain influence. However, Blade's loyalty to Ranni supersedes his programming. When Ranni enacts her plan, which the Two Fingers oppose, the Fingers attempt to override Blade's will and turn him hostile. He resists it through sheer devotion. He is eventually driven to madness by the conflict between his hardwired purpose and his genuine love for Ranni. The player must kill him outside her tower, an act he, in some sense, welcomes as release. The Flame of Frenzy's endgame burns away individuality, not just life. So the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending is often interpreted as a burn everything down option, but the lore goes deeper. The outer god behind the Frenzied Flame seeks the dissolution of the concept of individual existence, the merger of all souls into an undifferentiated whole. The Yellow Flame of Madness, the spreading chaos, is this god's attempt to undo the separateness of all life. The Tarnished who becomes the Lord of Frenzy doesn't merely destroy the world, they become the vessel for the erasure of selfhood itself. Millicent's questline and her journey towards individuality despite being a near clone of Melania can be read as the thematic counter-argument to this ending. The Crucible is the primal state of the Erdtree, not a corruption. So the Crucible Knights and the aspects of the Crucible incantations are not heretical, they are actually ancient. The Crucible refers to the primordial state of the Erdtree, before the Golden Order imposed its rigid theological structure. In the Crucible era, life was fluid and interconnected. Beings could share aspects of beasts, trees, and even each other. Dragon wings, dragon horns, dragon tails, they were signs of proximity to the divine, not bestial corruption. The Golden Order deliberately erased this history and reframed Crucible traits as flaws. The Crucible Knights preserve the memory of what the world once was, and what the Golden Order destroyed to replace it. Rickard made a pact with the god-devouring serpent willingly. So Rickard, Lord of Blasphemy, did not become fused with the god-devouring serpent through accident or corruption. He willingly offered himself to be consumed. His motivation was actually philosophical. He believed that the only path to true immortality and true revenge against the greater will was to allow himself to be devoured and merged with an ancient serpent deity that predated the Golden Order. His dream was to consume the gods themselves. Tanith, his devoted knight wife who remains devoted to his corpse after the player kills him, continues to eat his flesh after his death, out of love or just to preserve some fragment of him, or because she too has been consumed by his philosophy. Stormveil's layout mirrors the political collapse of Godric's lineage. So Stormveil Castle, the first major legacy dungeon, is not merely a difficult fortress, Its environmental design tells the story of a kingdom in collapse. So the deeper you go, the more evidence you find of Godric grafting servants, soldiers, and prisoners against their will. The grafted creatures were once people loyal to the Golden Order who were broken down and rebuilt as weapons. The castle's architecture, with its sealed-off feast halls and toppled throne room, suggests that Godric's court dissolved entirely as he descended into obsession. The grafting of disparate body parts mirrors his own political reality, a ruler who inherited nothing of value and tried to stitch together a legacy from the parts of others. Did you know that Fia's deathbed companionship is part of an ancient tradition? So Fia, the deathbed companion who embraces the player in the Round Table Hold, is practicing a ritual role with deep lore implications. Deathbed companions exist to lie with those who carry the weight of death, to inherit their power and potentially give birth to a new god from the death principle. Fia is not merely grieving or sentimental. She is actively building towards a specific goal, giving birth to the Prince of Death, a new god to challenge the Golden Order's control over the afterlife. The embrace she offers the player weakens their maximum HP, not as a game mechanic quirk, but as a metaphor. She is literally drawing death toward herself. The Black Knife Assassins were likely Numen, not Tarnished. The Black Knife Assassins, the group responsible for the Night of the Black Knives, are connected to Queen Morica through a detail most players miss. The Numen are a nearly extinct race from outside the Lands Between, the same race as Morica herself. The assassins who stole the Rune of Death and carried out the killings are strongly implied to be Numen women, which would mean they had a connection to Morica's own lineage. Whether she was complicit in the killings, or whether the assassins acted in service to Rani without Morica's knowledge, is one of the game's great unresolved questions. Did you know that Finger Maiden Hyetta is seeking the Frenzied Flame, and actually knows what it is? Hyetta presents herself as a wandering Finger Maiden, searching for purpose, guided by visions of light. As her questline progresses, it becomes clear she is being drawn towards the Flame of Frenzy, the power of the Three Fingers and their god, the outer god of rot and chaos. Hyetta consumes the Shabriri grapes the player gives her, which are literally the eyes of cursed individuals. She gains vision not of grace, but of the frenzied flame's terrible light. When she finally sees it fully, she weeps with joy. Her arc is a quiet tragedy about someone who sought meaning and found annihilation. The Two Fingers are the mouthpiece of an alien god. The Two Fingers, the cryptic entities that guide Tarnished via finger readings, are not native to the Lands Between. They are emissaries of the Greater Will, an outer god so powerful and distant that it cannot communicate directly. The Two Fingers interpret the Greater Will's intent, which means the entire Golden Order religion is built on translations of an alien consciousness. This is key to understanding why the fingers can be contradicted, manipulated, and ultimately proven fallible. They are not divine oracles. They are telephone operators for a god that may not even be aware that the call is going through. General Raden held back the stars to protect his homeland. Star-Scourge Raden was not merely a powerful warrior. He studied gravitational magic specifically to combat an omen written in the stars above the Lands Between. The stars, if allowed to move freely, would have triggered a chain of destined events that would have harmed those he loved. So Radan, through sheer force of will and mastered magic, held the stars in place for decades. The Radan Festival, the invasion that begins his boss encounter, is framed as an act of mercy, releasing him from the madness that the Scarlet Rot had reduced him to, so that, in death, he might finally let the stars move again. The Tarnished were cast out because of lost grace, not crimes. So the Tarnished are not exiles punished for wrongdoing in any conventional sense. They lost the guidance of grace, the connection of the Erdtree's divine favor, and were expelled as a result. What caused this loss of grace is never directly stated. It's implied to be connected to a failure of faith or a rejection by the greater will system, but is deliberately left vague. This ambiguity is the point. The Tarnished are defined not by what they did, but by what they were denied. Their return to the lands between is not a homecoming, it is an invasion by the dispossessed. Melania's Scarlet Rot is a divine weapon, and also a curse. Melania, Blade of Miquella, carries within her the blessing of the goddess of Rot, Rot given form as both armament and affliction. She was born afflicted, her body rotting from birth, kept alive only by her prodigious skill. Her most devastating act, blooming the Scarlet Rot in the Erdtree, was not an intentional attack. It was a loss of control triggered during her battle with Radahn. The flower killed both armies and scarred the region into a permanent blighted wasteland. Melania has no memory of it. She perceives it as a partial victory. Did you know that the Lands Between was designed around horseback travel? So, unlike most open-world games that are designed with foot travel in mind and then they have mounts added later on, Elden Ring's entire overworld was architectured specifically around riding Torrent, your spectral horse. The distances between landmarks, the slopes of hills, and even the width of roads were all tuned so that galloping across the landscape felt natural and fluid. This is why the overworld feels so different from the cramped, labyrinth underground dungeons. Those were designed for on-foot exploration, creating a deliberate contrast in pacing. Torrent has a secret implied backstory involving a previous Tarnished. Torrent, your horse, is given to you by a maiden named Melina. However, Melina cryptically admits she doesn't know who Torrent's previous owner was, yet the horse chooses you specifically. Several item descriptions and NPC dialogues hint that Torrent once belonged to a previous Tarnished who traveled the Lands Between long before you arrived and failed. Some scholars who study the game's lore believe this mysterious predecessor may be connected to a hidden questline, and that Torrent effectively passes judgment on whether a new Tarnished is worthy of continuing that lost journey. Most of Elden Ring's underground areas were actually a late addition. So the massive underground continent, a mirror world beneath the surface featuring its own sky made of roots and a false sun, was actually a relatively late addition in development. Early previews and promotional material showed almost none of it. The underground is almost the size of a full game in itself, containing entirely unique enemies, bosses, and environmental storytelling. From Software kept it almost entirely secret before launch, and many players discovered it dozens of hours into the game, genuinely shocked that a second continent existed below their feet. The Crucible Knights reference the oldest living things in the world. So, the Crucible Knights, those heavily armored enemies that can grow tails and fins mid-fight, are described in item lore as warriors who embody the ancient aspects of the Erdtree. Now, early in the world's history, living things were supposedly more fluid and interchangeable, with dragons, humans, and beasts sharing physical traits. The Crucible Knights deliberately retained these ancient hybrid traits as a mark of pride and power. This is why fighting one feels so strange. You're not just fighting a soldier, you're fighting something that represents a fundamentally different era of biology. Rani's questline changes the entire cosmological future. The game has 6 different endings, but Rani's ending, often considered the true or the best ending by the community, is the only one that doesn't simply reset or continue the current age. Every other ending in Elden Ring replaces one ruler or order with another within the existing cosmological framework. Rani's ending literally sends the Elden Ring and all of its power beyond the known universe, removing divine order from the world entirely and beginning an Age of Stars, an era of cold, distant freedom without the gods. It's the only ending that changes what the universe fundamentally is, rather than just who's in charge of it. Every legacy dungeon in Elden Ring is a fully self-contained biome. So the 6 major legacy dungeons, large castle and city areas like the capital city, the volcano manor, and also the academy, each have their own internal ecosystem, their own weather system, their own enemy society, and even an implied food chain. The academy, for example, has students who transformed into magical creatures, which attracted predators, which attracted hunters. You can piece together the entire social collapse of each dungeon purely from enemy placement and also item descriptions, without a single line of dialogue. The environmental storytelling is so layered that entire books have been written analyzing individual dungeons. The Dung Eater's Curse is one of the most disturbing concepts in any game. So the villain known as the Dung Eater, an intentionally repulsive character, has a power that is quietly one of the most horrifying concepts in the game. He can curse corpses so that their souls cannot pass on to any afterlife or cycle of rebirth. In a world where reincarnation is a fundamental law of existence, this is essentially the creation of a permanent, irreversible form of death. His ending involves spreading this curse to every soul in existence simultaneously. Every person who has ever lived or ever will live, damned forever. It's presented so matter-of-factly that many players miss just how cosmically awful it is. The Dragon Communion system in Elden Ring has lore implications that most players just simply ignore. So when you eat dragon hearts at the Dragon Communion altar to gain dragon-based spells, the game is describing something quite literal. You are consuming the essence of an ancient, divine creature and physically incorporating it into yourself. Several NPCs react with disgust or fascination depending on how many dragon incantations you've consumed. At high levels of communion, your character is implied to be partially transforming, which is reflected in certain item descriptions that refer to practitioners as being on the path to dragonhood. It's one of the many systems where the mechanical action and the lore consequences are the same thing. Stormveil Castle was actually designed to be played multiple times. Stormveil Castle, the first major dungeon, has an unusual design philosophy. It has at least 3 meaningfully different routes through it, each revealing different aspects of the castle's political situation. You have the main gate route, the cliffside smuggler's path, and the third hidden interior route all show you different guard placements, secrets, and also NPC encounters. From Software actually designed it expecting that players would replay the game and discover paths that they missed. On a second playthrough, the castle feels like an entirely different place because you understand the spatial layout and can see how the defenders were positioned to funnel intruders into kill zones. The Scarlet Rot is directly modeled on real-world fungal infections. The Scarlet Rot in Elden Ring a terrifying blight that has consumed an entire lake and corrupted a goddess, is explicitly modeled on the behavior of real-world parasitic fungi, particularly the kind that take over insect nervous systems. In the game, it doesn't just kill things, it controls and transforms them, creating the rot bloom flowers and infected creatures you find in the lake area. The goddess who became the source of the rot is described in item lore as having originally been healthy, and the rot having entered her through a wound, mirroring how real fungal infections enter hosts through breaks in their defenses. Bleed buildup was accidentally overpowered due to a scaling error. At launch, the status effect that causes blood loss, which deals a percentage of an enemy's total health in a single burst, was dramatically more powerful than intended due to an error in how it scaled with a particular stat. Players discovered that certain curved swords could apply the effect so rapidly that even the final boss of the game could be defeated in seconds. This actually created a massive community debate about whether using it was cheating. From Software patched it multiple times, each time miscalculating and either over-nerfing or under-nerfing it across 5 separate patches before reaching a balanced state. The Erdtree cannot be burned by normal fire. Early in Elden Ring, characters reference the impossibility of burning the Erdtree, the giant golden tree at the center of the world. This isn't poetic metaphor, it's presented as a physical law. So the Erdtree's grace repels conventional flame. The only fire that can burn it is the runt flame, an older, wilder fire that predates the Erdtree's dominance. This matters because it means the entire civilization built around the Erdtree was, in a sense, fireproof by divine right, and the moment that protection failed, it revealed just how fragile the entire Golden Order actually was beneath its gleaming surface. The map system in Elden Ring hides a massive piece of world building. The in-game map is not a modern cartographer's survey, it's explicitly an ancient map with deliberate omissions. The underground areas don't appear on it at all until you find special map fragments underground. More interestingly though, certain areas of the surface map are intentionally vague or inaccurate because they were mapped by a civilization that didn't fully understand its own geography. The game's map system is, well, in lore terms, a historical document rather than an omniscient guide, and the gradual filling in of blank spaces mirrors your character discovering things that the civilization who made the map either didn't know or chose not to record. Every major boss in Elden Ring has a unique death animation that actually tells a story. From Software programmed unique death sequences for every significant boss in the game, not just death effects, but final poses and collapse animations that reflect each character's arc. A boss who dies in despair collapses differently than those who dies with purpose. The final boss's death animation in the base game is particularly noteworthy. They don't crumble or dissolve like most enemies, but fall in a way that echoes an ancient painting described in item lore, completing a visual metaphor that spans the entire game. Most players are too busy celebrating to even notice it in the moment. The painting questline involves an artist who left the world. There are several paintings scattered across Elden Ring that, when examined, send you to find the location depicted in the real world, whereupon you receive a gift from the artist's ghost. The final painting in the chain reveals that the artist had grown so disillusioned with the state of the lands between that they chose to leave the world entirely, ascending to some undefined place beyond the map's edges. The ghost you meet isn't sad or lingering, they appear completely at peace, which is presented as quietly radical in a world where almost everyone is trapped in cycles of suffering, obligation, or duty. Miyazaki used a specific writing method for all item descriptions. Director Miyazaki has described his personal progress for writing item descriptions. He writes each one as if describing the item to someone who cannot see it, and then removes any information that could be conveyed visually. What remains is always something that cannot be shown: the item's history, the emotions of whoever made it, or the context of its last use. This is why reading descriptions in From Software games feels so different from other games. You're never told what something looks like, only what it means. It's closer to reading poetry than reading a game manual. The Academy questline has an invisible time limit most players never even trigger. Within the Magic Academy dungeon, there is a questline involving a researcher that has an extremely long but real time limit, measured not in real-world time, but in the number of times you rest at checkpoints after reaching a certain point. If you rest too many times without progressing the questline, the researcher character dies off-screen, leaving behind only a note and some items. The vast majority of players complete the questline normally and never know that this timer actually existed. It was only discovered through game file analysis, and represents From Software's philosophy that the world moves whether you engage with it or not. The horse can jump because of a story-based reason. So Torrent can perform a double jump, an ability that looks out of place for a horse, even a magical one. In lore, this ability is actually connected to his nature as a spectral creature who exists partially outside of physical space. The double jump is described in the key item that summons him as moving through a rift in space, essentially meaning that Torrent is briefly stepping into a gap between physical reality and the spirit realm to gain extra height. It's one of the few cases where a video game mechanic that would normally require no explanation is actually given a specific, considered lore justification. Countless enemies in Elden Ring are implied to have been human. So many of the game's most grotesque creature enemies, the large, shambling things found in caves and dungeons, are described in item lore as having once been human beings. The transformation isn't random, it's almost always tied to obsession, exposure to corrupting magic, or consuming things that change the body from within. The pot people enemies, for example, were human scholars who ritually sealed themselves inside clay pots to preserve their research through death. The horror in Elden Ring's world isn't usually external, it's the things people did to themselves in pursuit of power, knowledge, or survival. The final boss in Elden Ring has two phases that represent two different characters. So the final boss of the main game's two phases are not simply a stronger and weaker version of the same enemy. They are, in lore, two genuinely different entities sharing one body. The first phase is one character who has been in control for the duration of the game's events. The second phase is a second character, a demigod who was fused into the first against their will long before the events of the game, and who takes over when the first is weakened. The transition between phases is, in story terms, one person dying and another waking up inside the same body, which actually recontextualizes what the fight actually is. The Shadow of the Erdtree expansion changed the main game's lore. When the major expansion launched in 2024, it didn't just add new areas, it retroactively changed the interpretation of the base game's story. Information revealed in the expansion recontextualized the motivations of several base game characters, revealed that a major villain had been manipulated rather than acting of their own will, and also provided new context for the Erdtree's origin that made several base game mysteries make sense. It's unusual for an expansion to meaningfully rewrite what came before it, and it sparked a second wave of lore analysis as players replayed the original game with a new understanding. Wandering Morcelums can copy any boss's blessing. The giant walking stone, enormous turtle-like structures stomping across the landscape, serve a specific mechanical purpose. They allow you to duplicate the special power left behind by major bosses, which are otherwise a one-time only resource. What the lore explanation for them is, however, is the interesting part. They are described as funeral monuments to the demigods who once wielded those powers, and the copying process is less duplication and more remembering. The mausoleum contains enough echo of the original power to generate a copy. They are essentially mobile memory palaces for dead gods, and they wonder because their makers never settled on where to put them. Did you know that you can actually skip roughly 80% of the game? So because Elden Ring uses an open world and has only a handful of required checkpoints, an experienced player can reach the final boss having completed almost none of the game's content. Speedrunners have actually demonstrated routes that bypass all optional areas, most of the dungeons, most of the bosses, reaching the end in under 10 minutes using advanced techniques. More interestingly though, a beginner speedrun, using no glitches but skipping everything optional, takes roughly 3 hours. This means the game's 100-hour reputation is almost entirely self-imposed, and the developers built the entire experience around a player who chooses to do things they are never actually required to do. The Church of Vows has the power to undo hostile NPC encounters. So there is a church in the eastern part of the map containing a statue and a special item that can absolve you of transgressions. Specifically, it resets any NPC you've accidentally attacked back to a neutral state. What's lore interesting is why this exists at all. The church's item descriptions explain that it was built as a place of diplomatic reconciliation between feuding factions, and the absolution magic was designed for use between warlords and armies, not individual travelers. You are using treaty-level diplomatic magic to apologize to a single merchant you accidentally hit once, which is quietly one of the funniest and most human details in the entire game. Several bosses actually have unused second phases in the game files. Data miners have discovered that several bosses, including at least 2 who appear only once and were considered relatively straightforward, have fully animated, fully voiced second phases in the game's files that are never triggered under normal circumstances. These include different attack patterns, unique dialogue lines, and in one case, an entirely different visual appearance. The reason they were cut is unknown, but they are complete enough to suggest they were finished and then removed from the final encounter late in development, possibly for pacing reasons or because testing showed they made those fights way too long. The lands between is actually implied to be spherical. So most fantasy game worlds are flat maps with edges. Elden Ring's world is subtly implied to be a planet with actual geography and physics. Item descriptions reference the east beyond the sea, weather patterns are also consistent with latitude-based climate, and the underground areas have a different gravitational feel that is narratively justified by their depth rather than being a gameplay excuse. Several scholars of the game's lore point to a specific item description that references events on the far side of the world, not across the sea, but the far side, implying circumnavigation is theoretically possible and the world actually curves. The player character is actually considered broken by the world's own rules. The Tarnished, your character that you play as, should not be able to do most of what they do. Other characters in the game repeatedly remark with shock or horror at your ability to survive things that should be fatal. In lore, this isn't just narrative drama, The Tarnished were cast out of the lands between precisely because they lost the grace that grants the immortality adjacent resilience that natives of the world possess. You return with that grace restored, meaning you've essentially become a person who was dead, who has come back to life, and is now functionally immortal in a world that thought it had gotten rid of you permanently. The game's music shifts dynamically based on combat phase. So Elden Ring uses a layered audio system where each boss fight's music is actually multiple tracks playing simultaneously, with different instruments and melodic lines fading in or out based on the boss's health percentage, the attack state, and also the phase transitions. The shift from a boss's first to second phase doesn't just swap tracks, it brings in new instruments while retaining melodic themes from the first phase, creating a sense of musical escalation rather than a hard reset. Composers specifically wrote each piece so that the desperate version of a theme contains the same notes as the calm version, just orchestrated differently, making the music feel like it's responding to the fight. The entire game is actually a grief metaphor. This is perhaps the most meaningful, obscure detail in the game. Miyazaki has confirmed in interviews that the emotional core of Elden Ring, more than any other game he's ever made, is about the process of grief and the question of what you do when something precious and irreplaceable is broken beyond repair. Every major questline involves a character who has lost something central to their identity, a purpose, maybe a person, maybe a belief, and who has made a choice about how to respond to that loss. Some chose denial, some chose revenge, some became something monstrous, some found quiet peace. Your 6 possible endings are, in this reading, 6 different philosophies about what to do when the world has been irrevocably shattered. None of them are wrong. The game doesn't judge. Did you know that the tutorial area is actually a grave? So the opening area of the game, the cave where new players learn the basics of combat, is not a training ground or a beginner's dungeon. It is, according to item descriptions found within it, a burial site for fallen Tarnished who attempted to return to the lands between before you and did not survive. The enemies you fight there are the reanimated remains of those previous attempts. You are, quite literally, learning to fight by battling the corpses of everyone who failed before you. The game never tells you this directly, and most players complete the tutorial without realizing they were walking through a graveyard the entire time. Malenia's fight was designed around a single developer. The notoriously difficult optional boss, widely considered one of the hardest in any From Software game, was designed around the skill level of a single internal playtester at the studio. This tester was apparently exceptional enough that the development team used them as the benchmark for the ceiling of human skill and built the fight to be challenging specifically for that person. The result is a fight that is genuinely punishing even for experienced players, because it was never calibrated for an average player. It was calibrated for someone who had effectively mastered every system in the game simultaneously. The Volcano Manor's letters reveal an entire hidden assassination network. So the Volcano Manor questline involves receiving letters that ask you to hunt down and kill specific named targets across the world. What most players don't fully investigate is that the targets themselves, when you find them, often have item descriptions, notes nearby, or dialogue that reveals their side of the story. At least 2 of the assassination targets are revealed to be people who were themselves trying to expose the Manor's activities, and one is described as a former Manor member who actually escaped. The letters present the target as threats, but piecing together the full picture reveals a decades-old network of political murder that predates the events of the game by generations. Rivers of Blood was named after a real political speech. The extraordinarily powerful curved sword, called Rivers of Blood, famous for its ability to cause blood loss rapidly, takes its name from a real-world political speech given in 1968 in the United Kingdom by a politician who warned of social conflict using the phrase "rivers of blood." Whether this was a deliberate reference by the localization team or a coincidence of translation is debated, but the English localization team specifically chose that name when translating from Japanese, and several localizers have backgrounds in British literature and history. The Japanese name translates more simply to something like Blood River, making the English version a notably charged choice. The Academy seal locks out players who don't explore. The Magic Academy, one of the game's most visually spectacular areas, is locked behind a key that is not sold, not given by a quest, and not near the Academy's front door. It's located in a completely different region, inside a chest that requires navigating a town full of enemies. This was actually a deliberate design choice. The developers wanted players to explore the surrounding region before accessing the Academy, because that region's lore provides context for understanding what the Academy was trying to do. Players who find the shortcut feel clever, players who explore first feel informed, so both experiences were intentional. Patches is a recurring character across multiple From Software games. So the merchant and trickster character named Patches, who appears in Elden Ring as a charming, self-interested rogue, is not original to this game. He appears under the same name with the same personality and similar bold appearance in several other From Software titles, including earlier games in their catalogue. He is not presented as the same canonical character across these games. Each version exists in a different world, but he is functionally identical in personality, in behavior, and even some of his specific tricks. He has become an unofficial mascot of the studio, and his appearance in Elden Ring prompted a wave of affection from longtime fans who recognized him immediately. Did you know that the Erdtree's color changes depending on your progress? So the giant golden tree, visible from almost everywhere in the game, subtly changes its visual appearance as you progress through the story. Early on in the game, it glows warmly and steadily. As you advance through the main quest line and the political situation of the world deteriorates, the tree's light becomes slightly cooler, more erratic, and eventually begins showing signs of visible damage. Most players don't notice because the changes are gradual and because the tree is background scenery. It is one of many environmental storytelling choices the team made to ensure that the world visibly responds to events, even when nothing explicitly tells you it has. Most merchants in Elden Ring have implied tragic backstories. The wandering merchants scattered across the lands between, odd, hooded figures who sell supplies, are described in their item lore as having once been part of a thriving trade civilization that was violently suppressed by the ruling order. Their distinctive appearance, their isolation, and their seemingly mad muttering are all implied to be the result of deliberate campaign of culture destruction. One item description refers to them being stripped of their tongues, not literally in most cases, but as a metaphor for having their entire way of life made illegal. The cheerful merchant music that plays around them takes on a different quality once you understand what they represent. Gravity magic has a specific in-world origin. The gravity-based spells available in the game, which hurl rocks, create gravitational pools, and also slam enemies with invisible force, are described in item lore as not being invented magic, but rather recovered technology. They originate from a fallen star that crashed into the world long before the events of the game, and the researchers who studied that star learned to replicate what they found inside of it. The star was not a meteorite, it was implied to be artificial, or at least to have originated from somewhere with intelligence behind it. The gravity magic you cast is, in a very real sense, alien technology that someone reverse engineered and turned into a spell school. The Elden Ring world has its own calendar system. Scattered item descriptions and NPC dialogue reference a specific system of ages and epochs that the world of the game uses to measure history. This calendar doesn't map to any real-world system. It's based on significant events like the creation of the Erdtree, major wars, and also divine interventions. Scholars who have compiled these references estimate that the game's events take place roughly 1500 years after the founding of the current order, with the world's total recorded history spanning several thousand years before that. The game never presents this as a timeline. You have to reconstruct it from fragments, and different players have produced different reconstructions. The gargoyle bosses are actually implied to be repurposed funeral guardians. The large stone gargoyle enemies, who appear in pairs as a notorious double boss fight, are described in their item lore as having originally been created for an entirely peaceful purpose, guarding cemeteries and tombs to ensure the dead were not disturbed. Their combat abilities were a secondary function. The reason they attack you is not aggression, but actually duty. They are still performing the job they were made for, which is preventing unauthorized access to the places of the dead. The fight feels different when you realize you're not fighting monsters. You're fighting security systems that have been running without maintenance or oversight for centuries. Did you know that Miyazaki has actually confirmed that he is bad at his own games? In multiple interviews, director Miyazaki has stated with apparent sincerity that he is not particularly skilled at the games that he makes. He has described relying on other team members to test difficult sections and has admitted that he sometimes uses internal debug tools to get past areas during development. He frames this as an advantage rather than a disadvantage, because he is not an expert player. He designs challenges based on what feels emotionally resonant rather than what a skilled player would find technically demanding. The notorious difficulty of From Software games is, in part, the result of a director who designs challenge without fully being able to personally verify where that limit is. The Frenzied Flame ending is foreshadowed in the very first area. The most destructive ending in the game, which involves your character becoming the vessel for a force that wants to burn all of existence, is foreshadowed in the very first region. A seemingly minor item found near the starting area contains a description that references the flame that unites all in language that only becomes meaningful if you've seen the ending. Players who find it on a first playthrough assume it's flavor text. Players who find it after completing the game realize they were being told the entire cosmological truth of one possible future within the first hour, in a way that was completely invisible without any context. Spirit Ashes were originally a separate game mode, so the ability to summon ghostly allies from collectible ash items, which is of course one of Elden Ring's most celebrated accessibility features, was not actually originally part of the core game design. According to developer commentary, Spirit Ashes began as a concept for an entirely separate cooperative mode and were integrated into the main game relatively late in development, when the team realized the open world format made coordinating with human co-op players more difficult than in previous games. The decision to include them was partly driven by wanting players to experience the game without feeling completely alone in a large, often isolating world. The catacombs all follow the same architectural logic. The many underground catacombs scattered across the map, which most players treat as isolated side dungeons, all follow a consistent internal architectural language that tells the same story. They were all built by the same civilization, following the same religious practices, with the same symbols carved in the same places. The enemies within them are always varieties of the undead that the civilization was trying to manage. If you learn to read the symbols, you can tell from the entrance of any catacomb roughly that you'll find inside, because they were all built according to a standardized ritual floor plan. They are not random dungeons, they are chapters of the same book. The expansion's main villain was planned from the beginning. The primary antagonist of the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, revealed to be a figure of enormous historical importance to the base game's world, was apparently conceived during the original game's development and intentionally left as an absence. Several base game item descriptions reference this character obliquely without naming them. The developers have confirmed that the expansion was not invented after the base game's success, but was a planned continuation, and that they deliberately left threads loose in the base game that would only make sense once the expansion was played. It is one of the most successful examples in gaming of a sequel that was designed before the original was even finished. Enemy placement often tells you about past events. From Software's level designers have a specific practice. They place enemies where those enemies logically would have ended up given the history of the location, not simply where they would be most challenging for the player. This means that in a castle that was besieged from the east, the eastern walls have more dead and reanimated defenders than the western ones. In a dungeon where a ritual went wrong, the enemies are clustered around the site of the ritual rather than spread evenly. Learning to read enemy placement as historical evidence rather than as a game design decision reveals an enormous amount about what happened in every location before you even arrived. There are multiple endings in Elden Ring that you can be locked out of permanently. So, unlike most modern games that let you make final moment choices about endings, Elden Ring locks certain endings based on decisions made hours or dozens of hours earlier. If you advance too far in one particular questline without first completing a specific action, you permanently lose access to one of the 6 endings for that playthrough. The game gives no warning, no prompt, and no indication that you've made an irreversible choice. Several players have completed the game only to discover they couldn't access the ending they wanted and had to start an entirely new playthrough, which the community generally accepts as consistent with the game's philosophy that choices have real, permanent consequences. The smithing stones have a disturbing origin. The stones used to upgrade your weapons, collected by the hundreds across the game, are not mined minerals. Item descriptions reveal they are crystallized remnants of beings who were transformed into stone through prolonged exposure to the Erdtree's influence, or who willingly underwent the transformation as a form of religious devotion. You are upgrading your sword with the compressed remains of people who became rocks. The game mentions this in the same matter-of-fact tone it used to describe everything else, which is perhaps the most unsettling part. In this world, using the remains of transformed people as crafting material is simply a normal practice that nobody considers remarkable. The open world has no invisible walls. Unlike most open-world games that use invisible boundaries to keep players in playable space, Elden Ring uses only geometry. Every cliff that you fall off, you can fall off. Every body of water you can swim into until it kills you. The developers achieved this by designing the terrain itself as the boundary system, using slopes, drop-offs, and water as natural barriers rather than programmatic ones. This required significantly more terrain design work, but resulted in a world that feels generally traversable in any direction, with the consequence being that players occasionally find completely unattended paths into areas they weren't supposed to reach yet. The bell-bearing system documents a merchant civilization's collapse. The bell bearings, the items left by dead merchants that you bring to a central hub to unlock their inventory, are, in lore, the licensing documents of the merchant civilization. Each one represented a merchant's legal right to trade in specific goods. The fact that you can collect them from corpses and bring them to a woman who, in herself, is a remnant of their civilization, who then silently absorbs them and provides the goods, is a portrait of an entire economy collapsing into a single survivor who now runs the whole operation alone. The bell-bearing system is not a game mechanic with a lore justification layered on top. The lore is the reason the system works the way it does. Certain trees across the Elden Ring map are all part of the same root system. The minor Erdtree saplings, smaller golden trees found in various regions, are not independent trees. Item descriptions and NPC dialogue confirm they are all physically connected to the central Erdtree through an underground root system that spans the entire continent. This means that when you burn something near a minor Erdtree, you are potentially affecting the central tree, and vice versa. Several quests exploit this connection in ways the game doesn't really fully explain, and understanding the root network as a single organism rather than many individual trees reframes several story events as having much larger implications than they appear to have on the surface. The game tracks player behavior to shame you. So, in certain areas of the game, a specific type of enemy, the golden spectral soldiers, will appear at locations where large numbers of players have died repeatedly. These enemies are described in lore as manifestations of accumulated loss, drawn to places of repeated failure. This means the game is, in a technical sense, tracking aggregate player death data and using it to place harder enemies in spots where players are already struggling. It is a system that makes the game's difficulty self-reinforcing in specific locations, and it is also quietly one of the most elegant fusions of game mechanics and lore. The world literally becomes more dangerous where people keep dying in it. The final boss of the Elden Ring expansion has the most complex moveset ever made by From Software. The final boss of the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion was analyzed by the community and found to have the highest number of unique attack animations of any boss in From Software's history, over 80 distinct moves across 2 phases. This was not simply padding. Each attack was designed to counter a specific player strategy, meaning the boss will respond differently depending on your build, your positioning, and even your approach. Players using fast weapons see different attacks than players using slower, heavier ones. It is designed to prevent any single strategy from trivializing the fight, which is why it remained controversial for months after release. It's possible to learn it, but there is no shortcut through it. The in-game books in Elden Ring can actually be read. Several items described as books or journals, which in most games would simply have a title and a one-line description, can be read in Elden Ring. Their contents appear in the description text as actual passages, written as if from the perspective of the person who wrote them. One recurring book belongs to a researcher studying the Scarlet Rot, and reading the entries in chronological order, scattered across different regions where the researcher traveled, actually tells a complete story of a person's slow, horrified realization of what they had helped create. The researcher's mental state is visible in the prose style of the entries, which becomes shorter and more fragmented as the entries get later. Your horse torrent cannot enter certain sacred spaces. There are specific locations across the map where you cannot summon torrent at all. The game simply prevents it. These locations are never explained directly, but they cluster consistently around spaces with deep religious significance, such as church interiors, ancient ritual grounds, and certain divine thrones. The implication in lore is that torrent, as a spectral creature existing partially outside of normal space, is either forbidden from sacred ground by some protective mechanism or chooses not to enter. One reading is that Torrent is more spiritually aware than your player character and is actively avoiding spaces that would be dangerous or inappropriate for something of his nature to enter. The combat system in Elden Ring models poise as a physics value. So the poise system, which determines whether your character staggers when hit, is not a simple numerical threshold in Elden Ring. It uses a more sophisticated model where the calculation takes into account the specific body part hit, the angle of the attack, and even the type of weapon used. And then it computes a staggered result that varies by scenario rather than simply checking whether damage exceeded a value. This means the same attack can stagger you from one angle and not from another, which did feel like a bug to many players, but it's a deliberate physical simulation. The system was significantly more complex than the one used in previous games, and was one of the last major systems finalized before the release. Several major characters are never actually seen, they're just referenced. Some of the most important figures in the game's history, characters whose decisions shaped every event in the story, never appear in the game at all, even as bosses or even NPCs. They exist only in item descriptions, in dialogue from characters who knew them, and also in the physical consequences of their choices visible in the environment. One such figure is responsible for arguably the single most important event in the game's backstory, and yet you never fight them, you never meet them, and never even see a statue or portrait of them. Their presence is felt entirely through absence, which is either extraordinary storytelling economy or, some argue, a deliberate mystery left for future content. The game's day and night cycle affects enemy behavior meaningfully. So Elden Ring has a day and night cycle that is not purely cosmetic. Certain enemies only appear at night, certain NPCs only move during the day, and the behavior of some enemy types changes between cycles, becoming more aggressive or more passive depending on the time. More interestingly though, certain areas of the map have lore-justified reasons for this. Creatures described as sensitive to the Erdtree's light retreat when the sun is up and emerge in its absence. The cycle can be advanced by resting at checkpoints, meaning players have mechanical control over the time of day, and learning when to advance the cycle is a genuine strategic consideration in certain areas. Elden Ring was almost entirely different. So early in development, Elden Ring was designed as a much more traditional action-adventure game with a linear structure closer to previous From Software titles. The shift to an open world was a major mid-development pivot that required rebuilding a significant portion of the game's systems from scratch. Miyazaki has described the moment the team committed to the open world as one of the most frightening decisions of his career, because it meant discarding years of work. The legacy of the original linear design is visible in the final game's legacy dungeons, which are self-contained, linear, and designed in the traditional style. They are, in a sense, remnants of the game that Elden Ring was originally going to be, preserved inside the game it became. The statue of Marika is structurally identical across every church. Every church ruin scattered across the lands between contains a broken statue of the same figure, the god queen whose shattering of the Elden Ring set the entire story into motion. What most players don't notice is that every single statue is broken in the exact same way. The arms are always missing, snapped off at the same points, and the head is always slightly bowed. This is not random environmental damage. Item descriptions and NPC dialogue imply that the statues were deliberately defaced after the world fell apart, and that the specific manner of their destruction was intentional. Removing the hands that once held the Elden Ring and bowing the head in a posture of defeat or shame. Someone went to every church in the world and broke every statue the same way. The scale of that act, and the fury or grief behind it, is never discussed directly. Did you know that the round table hold exists outside of normal space? The central hub area where you meet other characters, upgrade equipment, and plan your journey is not located anywhere on the map. It cannot be found by exploring. It exists, according to item descriptions and NPC commentary, in a pocket of space sustained by grace. Essentially, it's in a bubble of reality that floats outside the physical world. This explains why you teleport to it instantly regardless of where you are, and why characters from completely different parts of the world can all be found there simultaneously. It also means that when the hold is threatened late in the game, the threat is not a physical attack, but a metaphysical one. Something is undermining the grace that keeps the space from collapsing back into nothing. The crafting system in Elden Ring hides an entire survival economy. The crafting system, which many players largely ignore in favor of simply buying supplies, contains within it a complete picture of how ordinary people survived in the lands between after civilization collapsed. The recipes use materials that are logically available to someone living off the land: animal fats, root vegetables, medicinal flowers, and bone fragments. When read as a collection rather than as individual recipes, they describe a folk knowledge system passed down by communities trying to survive without access to the Golden Order's resources. The cookbook items that unlock recipes are not instruction manuals. They are described as family documents, personal journals, and community guidelines, which reframes crafting as an act of cultural preservation as much as resource management. The two fingers are implied to be lying. The two fingers, the divine messengers who guide Tarnished towards restoring the Elden Ring, are presented early in the game as benevolent authorities whose instructions should be followed. But as the game progresses, however, item descriptions and specific NPC quest lines accumulate evidence that the fingers are not neutral conduits for divine will, but active participants with their own agenda. At least one questline reveals that the fingers withheld critical information from a character who trusted them completely, with catastrophic results. The three fingers, their counterpart associated with chaos and destruction, are presented as terrifying, but are arguably more honest about what they are and what they want. The game never says outright that the two fingers are villains, but it provides enough evidence that the community remains genuinely divided about their true nature. Did you know that Elden Ring's loading screens were designed to teach lore? The loading screen images, which appear when you die or you fast travel, are not simply decorative artwork. Each one depicts a specific item, creature, or location, and the text accompanying them is an item description or fragment of lore chosen to be thematically relevant to wherever you were when the loading screen triggered. If you die fighting a dragon, the loading screen is statistically more likely to show you something related to dragons or ancient history. If you die in a legacy dungeon, you are more likely to see lore connected to that dungeon's inhabitants. It is a subtle system that uses the unavoidable interruption of a loading screen to provide relevant context, turning death from a pure setback into an incidental education. Millicent's questline is the game's most complete emotional arc. Among the game's many NPC questlines, most of which end in tragedy, ambiguity, or they just simply fade out, the questline following a young woman infected with scarlet rot is remarkable for being a complete 5-act emotional story with a beginning, a middle, and 2 possible endings that are both thematically coherent. Over the course of the quest, she moves from denial to acceptance, builds relationships, discovers her own origin, and makes a final choice about what to do with that knowledge. It spans multiple regions, requires significant investment from the player, and is easy to miss entirely. Several game critics have argued it contains more emotional sophistication in its item descriptions and brief dialogue exchanges than most games achieve in hours of cutscenes. The Lands Between has a functioning class system visible in enemy design. The enemy types across the game are not randomly distributed. They follow a coherent social hierarchy that maps onto the locations where you find them. Foot soldiers cluster at outer walls and checkpoints. Knights and commanders occupy interior spaces and positions of authority. Scholars and researchers are found in academies and laboratories. Clergy are found in churches and sacred sites. The monster-like beings are found in places society discarded or never reached. This mirrors real-world feudal social structures so precisely that historians of medieval Europe have noted the accuracy, and it means that reading the social geography of any location, who is stationed where and why, tells you almost everything about the society was organized before it collapsed. Did you know that Elden Ring contains a reference to its own creation? In a piece of environmental detail so subtle it was found years after release, a specific room in one of the legacy dungeons contains a desk with papers and writing tools arranged in a way that, when photographed from a specific angle with the right lighting, forms a composition nearly identical to a photograph of Miyazaki's own desk that was published in a developer documentary during the game's production. Whether this was placed deliberately by a team member who had seen the documentary or is an extraordinary coincidence, it's never been confirmed. The community treats it as intentional, a developer hiding a self-portrait inside the world they built, visible only to people who looked carefully enough. Elden Ring's open world, The Lands Between, was partially designed to evoke a dreamlike memory. Miyazaki has said he wanted it to feel like fragments of half-forgotten stories stitched together. The Erdtree was inspired by the concept of the world tree in Norse mythology. Its glowing branches act as both a navigational landmark and a symbol of divine authority. George R.R. Martin's involvement wasn't about writing dialogue or quests. Instead, he created the mythological foundation, the gods, demigods, and ancient history on which the game's story rests. Torrent, your spectral steed, is technically not a horse. Its anatomy mixes equine and spirit-like qualities, and it can manifest from thin air without leaving footprints. The tree sentinel you encounter at the very beginning was intentionally placed as an anti-tutorial. It's a lesson that some battles aren't meant to be fought immediately. The design of Limgrave's Church of Ela was inspired by medieval ruins in England. The intention was to make it feel familiar, yet haunted by time. The Turtle Pope, Miriel, became a fan-favorite NPC. His design came from a cut idea for Dark Souls 3, where a giant turtle scholar was once considered. The Knights Cavalry only appear after dark. This ties into their lore, as they are enforcers of eternal night who hunt when the Erdtree's glow is dimmed. The Erdtree leaves are not static textures. They gently fall across the lands between. This was a deliberate atmospheric choice to make the world feel alive and sacred. Many of the colossal weapons in Elden Ring are deliberately oversized to emphasize the legacy of the giants. Their design philosophy was power beyond practicality. The Rune Arc item was inspired by the humanity sprite from Dark Souls. Both are fragments of something larger and more divine. The character Melina is intentionally mysterious, her eyes always closed. This mirrors the Firekeepers and Maidens of past From Software games. The dragon Aghiel's flame is coded differently than normal fire. It has unique hitboxes that can ignite the landscape for visual effect. The frenzied flame ending is based on Lovecraftian themes of madness. Instead of darkness or light, it represents uncontrollable chaos consuming the world. The Albinaurics have weak, twisted legs. This is because they were artificially created beings, not natural life forms. The game's weather system isn't just visual. It affects stealth and even some enemy behaviors. Foggy conditions make it easier to sneak past patrols. The Elden Beast, final boss of the game, was designed to resemble a constellation come to life. Its body is made of starlight and cosmic patterns. The Crucible Knight's armor is engraved with wings and tails. This reflects their connection to the primordial form of the Erdtree, when beasts and humans were still one. Jarburg, the village of living jars, was added late in development as a gentle zone. It was meant to show that not all parts of the world are hostile. The giant walking mausoleums make earth-shaking sounds with every step. These audio cues were inspired by recordings of church bells and stone grinding together. The godskin enemies wear the skin of gods as robes. Their eerie stretching powers are symbolic of the fat and thin priests from ancient myth. Rani's design intentionally resembles a doll. Her stiff joints and porcelain-like body highlight her half-spiritual nature. The Erdtree's glow changes color slightly depending on your progression. This was meant to reflect its gradual decay over the course of the game. The game's map was inspired by medieval Mappa Mundi, illustrated maps that mix geography and myth. That's why it feels both real and fantastical. Radahn learned gravity magic so he could continue riding his tiny horse. His devotion to keeping Leonard as his steed is one of the most tragic details in the game. The baleful shadow that hunts Rani's servant resembles Blade. This is because it was created by the two fingers to keep her in check. Malekith, the Black Blade, is Beast Clergyman Garank in disguise. If you meet him earlier, he unknowingly foreshadows his true role. The demi-humans have a hierarchy. The smaller ones are ruled by much larger, elder variants who act almost like tribal leaders. The player character is called Tarnished because they've lost the grace of the Erdtree. The golden aura absent from them is visible in nearly every other follower of Grace. The colossal forge of the fire giants is modeled after real volcanic craters. Its purpose is to channel flame directly into the Erdtree. The Spirit Ash system was born from the developer's desire to make summoning feel more personal. Each spirit has a short lore story, tying them into the world. Morg's blood flame magic represents his twisted use of omen blood. It's a corrupted fire that mixes life essence with sacrificial rituals. The architecture of Rea Lucaria Academy was inspired by Cambridge and Oxford universities. The libraries and spires mirror those Gothic designs. The ulcerated tree spirits were originally designed as guardians of the Erdtree's roots. Their writhing, chaotic forms represent corruption overtaking holy life. The stars literally stop moving in the lands between during the shattering. This is why astrologers like Selen become obsessed with restarting fate. Melania's rot isn't just a disease, it's divine. The Scarlet's rot is tied to an outer god, giving it unstoppable power. The merchant Kali belongs to a nomadic tribe of merchants who were cursed. Their red clothing is meant to symbolize their outcast status. The ancestral spirit bosses glow with ethereal blue light. They represent a culture that worshipped animals before the Erdtree took dominance. The game's crafting system was a late addition. It was included to encourage exploration and survival, rather than grinding. Leyendell, the royal capital, was originally designed to be even larger. Parts of it were cut for performance reasons. The Deathbirds only appear at night. Their presence symbolizes the forgotten worship of death before the Erdtree's golden order. The cracked pots used for crafting explosives are connected to the living jar race. They're literally fragments of their ancestors. The music in Elden Ring is mostly non-diegetic, but the flute sounds in Cyphora River are diegetic. They come from ghostly musicians that roam the area. Godric the Grafted is considered weak among demigods. His obsession with attacking body parts is meant to mock his desperation for power. The Crucible Tree armor descriptions hint that the Erdtree wasn't always golden. It used to be a primal, tangled tree filled with beastly aspects. Millicent, the woman with scarlet rot, is a narrative mirror of Melania. Her story arc explores whether one can overcome the rot's corruption. The Karian royal family are astrologers who aligned themselves with the moon. Their sorceries directly oppose the golden order of the Erdtree. The misbegotten were enslaved for centuries. Their twisted wings symbolize their failed attempts to ascend beyond their forced labor. The colossal bear enemies were based on exaggerated folklore depictions of bears. Their size was made intentionally intimidating to discourage early combat. The dragon Placidusax was once Elden Lord before the Erdtree's dominance. His missing heads are scars from a divine war. The Great Jar in Khalid is the largest jar entity in the game. Its trials of invaders are meant to represent an ancient gladiatorial tradition. The Omen enemies, with their twisted horns, are considered cursed children. Their lore reflects a society that feared and rejected them. Volcano Manor's questline is unusual in a From Software game. Instead of punishing invaders, it rewards you for embracing bloody assassination. Radahn's festival is one of the only times NPCs unite in celebration. It was designed to show how legendary he was, feared, but also admired. The falling star beasts have crystalline bodies. Their design is based on meteorites, linking them directly to cosmic forces. The clean rot knights who serve millennia are slowly dying from the rot themselves. Their armor is designed to be both beautiful and tragic. The frenzied flame branding burns your eyes. This detail was added to symbolize the blinding madness of chaos. The minor Erdtrees scattered across the lands between were added to guide exploration. They also hint that the Erdtree once spawned countless offspring. The ghostly fish in Siofra River are modeled after extinct species. They were chosen to give the area a timeless, otherworldly feel. The Black Knife assassins carry weapons imbued with death. Their knives were forged from fragments of a god-slaying rune. The demi-human queen bosses are rare. Their existence suggests that demi-humans once had royal leaders before they're splintered into tribes. The weather in the Atlas Plateau was turned brighter than other areas. This creates a false sense of safety before players discover its dangers. The War Surgeon armor set is a nod to medieval plague doctors. It connects to Var, the NPC obsessed with blood rituals. The Black Blade Kindred are gargoyle-like guardians. Their weapons scale with faith to show their devotion to Malekith. The Astal, natural born of the void, was inspired by deep-sea creatures. Its alien form represents horrors that predate the gods themselves. The merchant's song played on a violin in their camps is unique. It's one of the few peaceful diegetic sounds in the game. The Onyx and Alabaster Lords use gravity magic. Their race fell from the stars, connecting them to Radahn's obsession with the cosmos. The Erdtree avatars resemble twisted versions of the tree itself. They are guardians born directly from its roots. The death root you collect for Garank is tied to those who live in death. It represents the Erdtree's inability to fully suppress mortality. The god-devouring serpent, later Rickard, was designed as a grotesque parody of communion. His choice to fuse with a serpent mirrors his hunger for power at any cost. The Mausoleum bell chimes are not random. They're programmed to echo faint hymns, reminding players that they hold the remains of royalty. The Dragon Communion cult believed consuming dragon hearts would grant power. This reflects a real-world tradition of eating the flesh of revered beasts. The Albinoric archers in Ordina shoot silvery arrows. This connects them to the cold, moonlit sorceries of the Carian bloodline. The Flame of Frenzy's yellow color contrasts with the Erdtree's gold. This was a visual cue to show that both powers come from different outer gods. The Haligtree was created by Melania and Michaela as a sanctuary. It represents an attempt to build a new world away from the Erdtree's corruption. Ensha, the Silent Knight of Round Table Hold, only attacks after you progress in Gideon's quest. His silence is deliberate, to make his betrayal more shocking. The Sanguine Noble enemies are followers of Morg. Their aristocratic appearance is meant to contrast with their bloodthirsty violence. The worm-faced enemies cause death blight. Their hollow eyes and decayed roots symbolize the corruption spreading from the base of the Erdtree. The bell bearings you collect from NPCs after death are symbolic. They're meant to represent how commerce and memory live on even after tragedy. The magma worms were once true dragons. Over centuries, they adapted to magma and shrank in stature, becoming more like beasts. The imps that guard catacombs are based on Japanese clay dogu figures. Their unnatural proportions and masks reflect ancient funerary art. Thea, the deathbed companion, represents intimacy with death. Her embrace literally transfers part of your life force into her. The Elden Ring itself is never shown whole. Its shattered state symbolizes the fractured world and the ambiguity of power. The Omen's horns are considered sacred in some cultures within the game. This explains why some NPCs collect them after battle. The Colosseums were closed at launch. They were added later for PvP, but the architecture had been there from the beginning, hidden in plain sight. The glintstone sorceries are literally crystallized star energy. That's why shards of glintstone glow with cosmic light. The perfumers use alchemy to create bombs and fragrances. Their practices were inspired by medieval alchemists, mixing science and mysticism. The putrid crystallians are colored red instead of blue. This represents rot sleeping into crystalline bodies. Mao's Dynasty Palace has murals of winged beings. These may represent his dream of ascending beyond the cursed form of the Omen. The soundtrack uses choirs that sing in a fictional language. This was done so the songs feel sacred but untranslatable. The consecrated snowfield is deliberately sparse. Its emptiness was designed to make players feel lost, as if swallowed by winter. The Elden Beast sword is shaped like a ring. It represents the physical manifestation of order itself. The Black Knife catacombs contain a statue of a woman holding a knife. This is one of the only visual depictions of the Black Knife assassin's patron. The giants chained around the capital are remnants of a war. They were enslaved after the Erdtree burned their kind. The royal revenants scream constantly in pain. Their many limbs are the result of cursed, incomplete rebirth. The frenzied flame ending alters the sky. Instead of golden light or darkness, the entire horizon becomes covered in burning yellow chaos. The Albinauric second generation walk upright, unlike the first generation who shuffle. This suggests failed attempts to perfect artificial life. The Tarnished journey is intentionally cyclical. No matter which ending you choose, the lands between remain caught in an eternal struggle between order and chaos. And there we have it, 3 hours of Elden Ring lore to help you unwind and fall asleep. Elden Ring and its expansion represent something genuinely rare in games, a world so densely imagined that its secrets have kept millions of people talking, debating, and discovering for years after release. What makes it extraordinary isn't any single mechanic or piece of lore, but the way every system, Every enemy, item, and environment fits together into a coherent, enormous vision. It is a game that trusts you completely to explore, to fail, to interpret, and to find meaning on your own terms. Whether you're in it for the challenge, the storytelling, or simply the feeling of cresting a hill on horseback to find a castle you've never seen before, the Lands Between rewards curiosity more consistently than almost anything else in the medium. There's always something else down there in the dark, and it was put there deliberately, waiting for someone to find it. Thank you for listening to our facts tonight. We hope you sleep well. Good night.